type has differentiated their thought processes, but that makes the extroverted feeling type extremely nervous. But the extroverted feeling type is at ease in parties and conversations, very loud at the dinner table, and that makes the introvert nervous. The one has made superior what is inferior in the other, and so they both make each other nervous and ill at ease, and those are shadow projections. The person who is making you nervous for no accountable reason, you don't know them after all, you just instinctively know they walk in the door, you don't like them. You've made a shadow projection. You instinctively know that what is inferior in you has been developed in a superior way in that person. So the two introverts and extroverts are always speaking at cross purposes. So that's the primary archetype at the beginning of the individuation process. This is the material that comes up. It is biographical, and the individual will begin to transfer onto the analyst. This is what's called the transference. It was a concept that was first developed by Freud. One's personal biographical associations, and in particular with respect to the parents. The analyst will be cast into the role eventually of the father, and this will be going on, or mother, depending on the relationship. Even Jung says he will get patients who occasionally will attribute maternal attributes to him. And so that's the first type of material that begins to come up, and you have to begin to work through that before you can get to the archetypal, to the collective unconscious itself. Now, with respect to the outer world of society, there is the persona. And the persona is different from the ego. The persona is the role that you choose to play in society. You're sitting next to a person on a plane, and you're having a very lovely conversation, and then after a while the stewardess comes by and says, can I get you another drink, Senator? And suddenly the conversation is not the same as it was before. Now you've stepped into the role of the person's persona. Now, the persona is the role that we play in society. And if the ego identifies with the persona is the Greek word for mask, and in the Greek tragedies, the actors wore the masks, the personae, and it means actually mask and sounding through the mask. So you are playing a role in society, but you are to be careful to differentiate that role from your ego. And people who don't do this are what we call a stuffed shirt. They're empty. They have inflated. They have identified with the office. So-and-so plays Hamlet at school and ends up being Hamlet all year long. That's an inflation of the ego identifying itself with the role. So we're all playing roles. So it's very important that we learn when we step into a role and when we step out of it. If we don't, you go crazy. So Jung says the persona is the function that relates the ego to the outer world of society. What relates the ego to the inner world of the collective unconscious is the anima and the animus. Now, these are the gateway to the collective unconscious. The unconscious, the collective unconscious of the man, or the unconscious generally of a man, is characterized as having a feminine nature. The unconscious of the woman is characterized as having a masculine nature, consistent with this theory of pairs of opposites here. And the male will project onto the female what is in his unconscious, but it will be, first of all, it will have been formed and built up through the male's biographical associations with the mother. The mother is the first thing, ideally anyway, that the individual encounters, and that begins to shape the male's anima image, so that he generally has a pretty clear idea of what his ideal female type is in the unconscious. And when he is attracted to a woman, what he is attracted to is that anima projection. There's a dimple there or something, and it just fits. And with respect to the animus, the same situation, except that Jung says the anima of a man is associated with inferior feelings, since men tend to be on the side of differentiating their thinking, and accounts for mood swings in men. The grumpy, crotchety old man is under the possession of his anima, which is inferior feeling. There's been a failure to differentiate the conscious from the unconscious there, and as a result of that failure, the unconscious gradually swallows up the consciousness. With respect to the animus is associated with inferior thinking in the woman, This is where we begin to move into possibly sexist areas with respect to Jung. He says the female unconscious is characterized by opinion. He says there's no arguing with a woman. Once you get into a certain point, the animus steps in and starts throwing out these irrational opinions without any apparent logical connection. And so you can see Jung has been attacked by feminists left and right as a result of that rather sexist orientation, but there it is. Now, at this point in the analysis, the transference generally begins to shift over to the lover archetype. And so the female may begin to project onto the analyst potentialities of a possible lover. And so that begins to activate the collective unconscious. That is the gateway. Now, the collective unconscious itself, insofar as it is distinguished from the personal unconscious, is impersonal. It is essentially the psychological equivalent of the body. The body is the same, no matter where you go in the world. The same organs, the same structure, and has been the same for about 90,000 years at least. So Jung says there ought to be some way in which the psyche is fundamentally the same. And this is the collective unconscious. And this accounts for the fact that we find in myths all over the world these archetypes, the archetype of the hero. He says the psyche is set up in such a way that it simply projects these contents spontaneously. For example, he says the archetype of the hero, Jung associates with the collective unconscious's version of the sun and what it does. He says the repeated experience of the rising and setting of the sun and of the sun's annual passage through the zodiac, the two solstices representing the noon and midnight of the year, are interpreted by the collective unconscious as the archetype of the hero. And so you get hero myths where the hero is the sun. You get the Egyptian myth of the sun god Re descending into the underworld, and this is called the descent into the belly of the whale, or the night sea journey, and we'll encounter this again in the hero myth. I bring this up here because I want to show its influence on Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell's hero myth comes right out of this discussion. And the sun descends into the underworld, makes its night sea journey, where in this particular Egyptian myth it battles these monsters and is born again the next morning. Where you have Hercules doing the 12 labors, and he's wearing the lion, which is a conspicuous symbol for the sun, and so we have the sun's passage through the 12 signs of the zodiac, and so forth. So he says the hero myth is the archetype of this solar process. But as far as Jung there's a criticism here. Insofar as Jung is concerned, the hero myth, when he thinks of it, is generally thought of as solar. But what he misses, and what Campbell will later point out, is the sun hero is actually a patriarchal inversion of an earlier system of sentiments that associated the man with the moon and the woman with the sun. And you can find vestigial echoes of this, for example, in the German language, where the sun is die Sonne, which is feminine, and the moon is der Mond, which is masculine, and the reverse is true in French, la lune, and le soleil. The genders are reversed. And he says you can go, Campbell does, go all over the world and you can find these early echoes of the sun being associated with the female and the moon being associated with the male. This is a point, one of the weak areas in the Jungian system is this poor relationship to the historical phases of mythology, how they have developed over time. And this is where Campbell comes in and, as we'll see, contributes his share to this. So Campbell's been very often dismissed as a Jungian, which isn't fair because he has made up for what Jung has lacked in studying the different historical transformations of mythology. And that will end up having an effect on the Jungian system of archetypes. We will see that maybe the archetype of the mandala, which Jung says is essentially the symbol of wholeness, the symbol of the self, may not be innate in the psyche, but maybe a historically conditioned form. But we'll get to that later. So that's the Jungian theory of the archetypes, and it explains why we have the myth of the virgin birth all over the world, for example. The psyche spontaneously produces these images because that is the way it is set up, just like the body is the same wherever you go. The third and final stage of the individuation process is associated with the archetype of the self, and that's the central process here. He says, I noticed as the analysis would proceed in a number of my patients that they would begin to have dreams or make references to me as though I were a magician or a shaman or a god or a healer. And he says that begins to act, we've moved out of the biographical realm of daddy and mommy, or the potential lover, into the collective realm now of the God archetype. And